Hello, I'm Llewellyn King for MECFS Alert, which of course stands for myalgic encephalomyelitis, or the other name, the less popular name, chronic fatigue syndrome. And I am here to talk to one of the distinguished European physicians who's been practicing for many decades in this area, Dr. Kenny De Meirleir. Doctor, it's a pleasure to have you on the broadcast. Very nice to see you. You are of great interest to us because you have told me that you have treated 20,000 or had 20,000 patients or more.
Between 15 and 20,000, yeah.
Over how many years?
Since 1990.
And are there commonalities when you deal with a new patient? What do you say to them? How do you encourage them and explain to them that they are going to have a very long struggle with a very difficult disease?
I don't do that way. I try to say it in a positive way because I try to show them that I understand what they are feeling, and I try to understand that many people have the same symptoms and the same abnormalities in their blood, and that after all these years we really understand what is going on. Doesn't mean that there are standardized treatments, but at least we understand why they have these symptoms.
And how often do you see a patient?
How often? I see him initially for a workup, and then every 3 months.
And that's basically for the rest of their lives, probably.
No.
You have cures?
I mean, 50% of patients don't need me anymore after a while. 30%
do they not need you because they're better or because they're learned to cope on their own?
They're better and they don't need any treatment anymore.
And what kinds of treatment are you giving them?
But that really depends. It's really individualized medicine. You have to look what the major problem is in these patients. But it's mainly a problem of inflammation, and you have to look what the reason is, why they have this inflammation, and whether this disease has really evolved from an infectious disease towards an autoimmune disease, or if it's still mainly an infectious disease, a cold infection which has not been treated.
So you believe the trigger is an infectious disease that leads to an autoimmune dysfunction?
That is my belief, yes.
And that's always the case?
That's always the case.
So that there's no other trigger? Exercise alone, for example, is not a trigger?
Well, that depends what your definition of trigger is. There are a number of pre-existing situations that stress the immune system, and that makes these infections have more success in doing damage in the body.
Do you find a greater rate of cure or of well-being among men and women, or do you find both react similarly?
They both react similarly, but it depends of the stage of disease. If there's a lot of consequences, if there's a lot of serious consequences, if it's really a severe autoimmune disease, then it becomes much more difficult to get grip on the disease. If it's still an early stage disorder, like we see in 16, 17, 18-year-old, it's not that difficult to get them back to a normal life.
There's no silver bullet. What do you prescribe?
Well, that really depends on what we find. If we find a chronic cold infection proven to be that it is related to the disease and related to immune parameters, then we treat them with, for example, very specific antibiotics, very narrow spectrum antibiotics.
Would you like to name some of these for us?
For example, azithromycin, really antibiotics that are not broad spectrum but are really into these intracellular infections. They're all intracellular infections.
One of the things that interests people is what about the off-label uses of drugs, and how do we find what drugs, and for example at the moment there's a lot of interest in a cancer drug, that used off-label may have an effect? What is the mechanism for determining what might work even though it was not developed for this disease and has not traditionally been prescribed for this disease?
Well, I'm an academic internist, and I sit with one foot in the lab and one foot in the office, and then you can test out things. It's called scientifically based medicine. So you have a hypothesis, and then you go for it, and you test it out in vitro, whether it works or not. It was the rituximab study is the same thing. It's a coincidence that they saw that these MECFS patients got better when treated for lymphoma, and that was really a coincidence. And then they asked the question, is it useful for other patients? And these are the kind of questions we also ask. Because it becomes an autoimmune-like disease, there is a lot of overlapping with MS and with other autoimmune diseases. And for these diseases, they get treated, although we don't know what the mechanism is.
Those of us who have done some work in the field know that this is a global disease with a lot of sufferers. Why is it so little publicized? Why do people know so little about it? I've spoken to a lot of doctors who I've met either socially or because they're treating me for some other ailment, who really know nothing about it and have heard of it but do not know anything.
Well, this is disease you can compare with when I started my career. There was a lot of fever of unknown origin. And on every ward in internal medicine, there were a few patients with fever of unknown origin, and they came in often without diagnosis, and they went out without diagnosis. This is also not a very popular disorder, because doctors cannot make a diagnosis. They see criteria, and you fit the criteria, and then you get from some people the diagnosis. But it's not very interesting for doctors to study a disease where the mechanisms are not known, and where the pharmaceutical industry is not interested, because there is no underlying pathological mechanism known officially.
And is there any attempt to bring the pharmacological industry into this?
Yeah, I think more and more they're getting interested, because I think the pharmaceutical industry is interested in numbers, and there are numbers published, and I think we put it under their attention that this is a very bad disease. I mean, of all diseases, chronic disease you can get, this is one of the worst.
You talk about Rituxan. The other drug that comes up is Ampligen, which has only, I think, been partially tested in the United States. Why are these drugs so horrendously expensive? If they were widely available, people couldn't afford them at $60,000 and $90,000 and $25,000, different figures that I've heard.
Well, I think the Ampligen was not okayed by the FDA, that's one thing, and the rituximab is still in phase 2, phase 2A, and they need to do a larger study, because I think people can die from this drug if you have no more B cells and you run into a bad infections like meningococcemia. You will die if you don't get diagnosed very early. So I think this drug is not a drug without any danger.
Do you yourself prescribe it?
No, I don't.
Have you had any experience with your own patients on Ampligen?
With Ampligen I did, but not with rituximab.
And how do you feel about Ampligen?
Well, Ampligen was a partial success, and they should analyze the patients who really benefited from them, because this is a very heterogeneous disorder. The endpoint of the disorder is the same. It becomes an autoimmune disease, but the beginning of the disorder is very, very heterogeneous, and the players in the disease are very heterogeneous. So that means that all the drugs you think you're going to treat ME with will never be 100% successful, because you have to start doing subgrouping and treat those subgroups which are homogeneous.
Are there countries where there is more prevalence of myalgic encephalomyelitis than others?
This is my personal opinion, but I think this is a disease that's more prevalent in the Viking countries. So if patients have an origin which is Scandinavian or Northern England or even Ireland, we see that there are more patients from there. I have more patients from Norway than from Belgium, really, at some moments, because it's very, very prominent in Norway. But of course, they have other undiagnosed diseases there, like tick-borne diseases, but I think that these people are more prone to develop autoimmune diseases, and that's known because, for example, MS is the most prevalent in Finland from the whole world, and so I think personally there's going to be a relationship shown in the future with one or more Viking genes.
If you were addressing the institutions that deal with disease, governmental, private, large foundations, etc., what would you urge them to do now?
Do basic research into what causes the chronic inflammation, atypical inflammation in these patients, because that's where the answer is.
Thank you very much, Doctor. It's a pleasure to talk to you. We will be back with more conversations with Dr. De Meirleir.
If you would like to sponsor MECFS Alert, please contact us at mecfsalert@gmail.com. Help us to help you.